Marta had never heard of her great-uncle Gregory. To be honest, she didn't even know she had any relatives who lived in the little town by the forest. So when the letter arrived, informing her that she had inherited a house from him, she was a little surprised. It came out of nowhere. No one had ever mentioned Gregory. No one knew much about him. It seemed strange, but the idea of inheriting something, even from a mysterious relative, felt too good to pass up. So Marta packed her things, said goodbye to her small apartment in the city, and made her way to the house that was now hers. The house was, well, let's just say it looked like it had seen better days. It was old, weathered, covered in ivy, and it had this eerie, almost taunting vibe to it. The kind of place you might expect ghosts to be hanging around, waiting to tell you their stories. But Marta didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. When she stepped inside, the smell of dust hit her like a wave. The air felt thick with time, as though the walls had stories to tell if only she could understand them. The furniture was old, antique. Really everything was heavy with history. And there was this one huge mirror in the hallway. It was the kind of mirror that didn't just reflect your image, but seemed to look right through you. After a long drive and a somewhat unsettling welcome from the house, Marta tried to settle in. The first few nights were quiet, except for the creaks of the old wood and the strange chill that seemed to come from nowhere, as if the house itself was breathing. But it was the third night that things started to feel different. Marta had just gotten into bed, the sheets cool against her skin. The house was quiet, too quiet. She tried to sleep, but something was off. She kept thinking she heard faint noises, whispers, almost like a soft murmur. But when she looked around, nothing was there. And then she saw it, her shadow, cast on the wall from the dim light of her bedside lamp. Move. It wasn't a trick of the light, not at all. The shadow seemed to stretch. It shifted in ways that didn't match her own movements. For a moment, it looked like it was just a natural shadow flickering, but then it did something that froze her blood. It paused while she moved, like it was waiting. Her heart raced. Okay, maybe I'm just tired, she whispered to herself. But then the shadow seemed to twitch again, a slow, deliberate movement that didn't match her own. She jumped out of bed and rushed to the mirror at the end of the hallway. Her reflection seemed fine, normal, but the feeling, something was wrong. That's impossible, she whispered, shaking her head. I'm just tired, but the feeling lingered. And when she turned back to the hallway, her reflection didn't move quite the way she did. For a split second, it lingered behind her, like it was hesitating, waiting for her to make a mistake. That was when Marta knew. Something in this house, something old and hidden, was alive. The next day, Marta tried to ignore what happened. She told herself it was just the stress of moving, adjusting to the house. But that night, as the sun set and the shadows crept through the house again, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Around midnight, she found herself standing in front of the mirror again. She had no idea why, but there she was, staring at her reflection like it was going to give her answers. That's when she heard it, a voice, faint but clear, whispering from behind her, "You should leave. You should leave before it's too late." Marta spun around, but no one was there. Her breath caught in her throat, and the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, like someone had turned on the air conditioning. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer, but she saw something else, something she couldn't explain. In the mirror, her reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was different. It was as if there was someone else standing in the background, someone dark and twisted, almost alive in the glass. Marta couldn't tear her eyes away, transfixed by the thing that seemed to be watching her every move. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror smiled, a grin too unnatural, Marta gasped and stumbled back. The reflection didn't move like she did. It stayed frozen, grinning. Her pulse raced. She stumbled to the door, almost tripping, and slammed it shut. She leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, her mind reeling. Marta couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to know what was happening. She dug through the old books and papers left behind by her great-uncle, and that's when she found a tan old journal, yellowed and cracked from age. It was Gregory's. He wasn't just some ordinary man. Gregory had been an alchemist, a seeker of immortality, but immortality comes at a price. In the journal, Gregory described how he had made a deal with a dark entity, a shadow spirit, to gain eternal life. But the deal came with a curse. The shadow would follow the descendants of his bloodline, tormenting them until they gave up their own souls. And now, Marta was the next in line. The shadow was after her. It had been waiting for years. For someone like her, someone who didn't know the history of the house or the price Gregory had paid. And now it was her turn to pay the price. Marta couldn't breathe. The weight of the journal felt heavier in her hands with every passing second. Her mind raced as she flipped through the pages, desperate for answers. The dark entity Gregory's shadow wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it had been watching her since the moment she stepped into this cursed house. The journal contained sketches, drawings of the shadow that once followed Gregory, and the terrible rituals he performed to try to control it. Each page was filled with descriptions of failed attempts, of people who had come before her and paid the ultimate price. The shadow wasn't just a spirit, it was a parasite, feeding off the souls of those who inherited the curse. Gregory had tried to escape it, but his only hope had been to bind the curse to the house, so it would stay trapped. However, he had never been able to break free. "I can't let it take me," Marta whispered to herself, determination building in her chest. She couldn't just accept her fate. She had to fight, even if it meant facing the thing she had been so terrified of. There was a ritual, a dangerous one, that could banish the shadow for good. Gregory's notes were cryptic, but one thing was clear. It had to be performed at midnight, when the veil between the worlds was thinnest. But there was a catch. To complete the ritual, the person performing it had to offer up something of themselves, a sacrifice. And Marta knew, deep down, that the price would be high. That night, as the clock struck 12, Marta found herself standing in front of the mirror again. The house seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with tension. Every corner of the room felt like it was alive, as though it was watching her. She stood still, barely able to move, as the shadows around her seemed to stretch and twist, gathering in the corners of the room. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the whispering began, low at first, like a breeze passing through, but then it grew louder, more distinct. The voice was familiar now. It was the same one she had heard the night she first saw the shadow in the mirror. "You can't escape," it murmured, its voice slithering into her thoughts. "You belong to me. You always will." Marta's heart pounded in her chest, but she held firm. She couldn't back down now. As she started to chant the incantation from Gregory's journal, the mirror began to ripple, the surface distorting like water. Her reflection, or rather it, was no longer her own. The shadow was now moving in the mirror, its twisted form flickering in and out of focus. And then, from the depths of the glass, a figure stepped forward, a man, tall and dark, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore right into her soul. He was the one who had made the deal, the one who had bound Gregory's fate. The shadow was no longer just a presence. It was a force. "I told you, you can never escape me," the figure said, his voice like the scraping of nails on glass. The mirror trembled, and Marta felt a cold hand grip her heart, but she didn't stop. She had to finish the ritual, no matter the cost. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils creeping through the mirror and wrapping around her body like chains. The words of the incantation spilled from Marta's lips, even as her voice trembled with fear. The figure in the mirror smiled, a cruel, knowing grin. "You think you can defeat me with a few words," he laughed, his voice growing louder. "You think you can banish me with your little ritual? You are nothing. You are mine." Marta's body shook as the shadow tightened its grip. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls bending and warping as if the house itself was alive. She felt herself slipping her energy, her soul draining away with each passing second. But then she remembered. There was one last step in the ritual, the sacrifice. She had to give up a piece of herself. It wasn't just her body, but her soul. She wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting for her own freedom. She had to make the choice. Without hesitation, Marta pressed her palm to the mirror. As she did, she felt her essence split, a part of her soul drawn into the glass. The pain was unbearable, but she kept her hand there, focusing on the chant, pushing through the agony. The mirror shattered. When Marta opened her eyes, the room was silent. The shadows were gone. The oppressive weight of the house had lifted. The mirror was shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor. Her reflection was gone, but the feeling of relief didn't come. Something wasn't right. She had done it. She had freed herself from the shadow, but at what cost? Her soul was fractured. She felt it, a hollow emptiness deep inside her. She could feel the remnants of the shadow's grip still lingering in the air. She had sacrificed a piece of herself to banish the darkness, but she had left a part of her soul behind. The house seemed to whisper, almost as though it was alive again. Marta didn't know what to think anymore. Had she truly won, or was she just trapped in a new kind of prison? As she walked out into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't escaped. The shadow was gone, but something else was watching her from the corners of her vision, and in the back of her mind, she heard the whisper once more, "You can't run from me forever." Marta couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't fully escaped the shadow. It had been banished, yes, but a part of it still lingered, waiting for the perfect moment to return. She had sacrificed so much of herself, and while the house was quiet now, the darkness within her heart seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. She moved back to the city, trying to find a sense of normalcy. But nothing felt the same. The laughter of friends, the bustle of the streets, even the sunlight felt wrong somehow. It wasn't the house she had left behind. It was the shadow inside her. She couldn't even look at herself in the mirror without feeling a strange unease. The reflection felt distant, as though someone else was staring back at her. It was as though her soul was fractured, divided, incomplete. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, there was a knock on the door. Startled, Marta opened it to find a man standing on the other side, a stranger, but with an aura of familiarity. His eyes were intense, dark pools of knowledge, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of ancient wisdom. "I know what you've done," he said simply. Marta froze, the air around her growing thick. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm here to help you," the man replied. "To finish what was started." The man introduced himself as Victor, a scholar of the occult, someone who had been searching for Marta for months after hearing whispers of the ritual. It seemed that Gregory's curse wasn't something that could be easily defeated. The shadow had been bound, not truly vanquished, and now it was waiting for the right moment to reclaim its power. "You can't outrun it, Marta," Victor said, sitting across from her at her kitchen table. "The ritual you performed didn't destroy the shadow. It just sent it into hiding, into the deepest parts of your being. It's still there, feeding off your fears, waiting for you to slip up. It means you have to sever the link between you and the shadow completely," Victor said. You must give up everything you've known, everything you've built in this life. Your ties to the living world, to your identity, everything. The idea of it was overwhelming. Could she truly let go of everything? The thought of giving up the life she had fought so hard to build, to surrender herself completely, it was terrifying. But at the same time, Marta knew she had no other choice. Victor's expression softened, but his eyes remained steady. There's a way to truly banish the shadow, but it requires a deeper sacrifice. Not just a part of your soul, but your entire connection to this world. Marta's breath caught in her throat. What does that mean? Victor guided Marta back to the house. It was the only place where the ritual could be completed. The moon was full, casting a ghostly glow across the mansion, making it seem even more alive than it had before. "Are you ready?" Victor asked, his voice low and solemn. Marta nodded, though she could feel the weight of fear pressing against her chest. She wasn't ready. No one could ever truly be ready for something like this. But if there was any chance of escaping the shadow for good, she had to try. Inside the house, the air was thick with the remnants of the curse. The mirrors in the hallway seemed to pulse with energy, as if alive, reflecting not just Marta, but her own deepest fears. Victor set down an ornate bowl in the center of the room. The floor beneath them was covered in dark symbols, each one glowing faintly. He began to chant softly, his words in a language Marta didn't recognize. She felt herself being drawn into the ritual, her body trembling as the power in the room grew stronger. The shadows twisted around her, swirling like smoke, and the familiar presence of the dark figure began to take shape. The figure appeared before her in the reflection, the broken mirror. This time, it was not just a shadow. It had a face, one that seemed to shift and change, 1,000 different faces swirling together, none of them hers. "You think you can banish me for good?" The shadow's voice hissed from the mirror. "I am eternal. I am the darkness that exists in every heart and every soul. You cannot escape me." But Marta stood tall. She had to. There was no turning back. The ritual's power surged, and for a moment, Marta could feel herself slipping, her sense of self, her memories, everything she had known, starting to dissolve. The shadow reached out to pull her back into its embrace, but she fought it. "You are not me," she shouted, feeling the words burn through her chest. "I am more than you. I will not become you." The final chant echoed through the house, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The world seemed to hold its breath. When Marta opened her eyes again, she was alone in the room. The shadow had vanished, the mirrors were shattered, and the house was still. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air was clean, the weight lifted from her shoulders. But Marta could feel it, the emptiness. The house was no longer alive with energy. The echoes of the curse were gone, but so was her connection to the world she once knew. The price of freedom was high. Marta no longer felt like herself. The memories of her past life, her family, her friends, her experiences had all been erased. She was free from the shadow, but the cost was everything she had once held dear. She couldn't even remember her own name. Victor stood beside her, watching her carefully. "You are free," he said softly, "but you will never be the same again." Marta looked around, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. "What now?" Victor's eyes were filled with sympathy, but also something else, something like understanding. "Now you begin again, you rebuild, but this time you do it without the shadow. You do it without the curse." Marta didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never let the darkness take hold of her again. The shadow was gone, but the lesson was clear. Some sacrifices were too great, and some shadows could never be fully escaped.